edition is Combating Financial Frauds with Technology. Our next session is an interesting panel discussion on the need of the hour for payments industry, creation of negative database of merchants and customers. It is my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator, Mr. Kalpesh Mehta, Senior Director, Alvarez and Marsal, followed by our panelists, Ms. Bhavna Samiran, Senior Legal Counsel, Payments at Amazon Pay, Mr. Sunil Rongala, Vice President, Strategy, Innovation and Analytics at Worldline, and Mr. Ankit Bhatnagar, Head of Product and VAS Business, Mswipe Technologies. A very warm welcome to all of you. Over to you, Mr. Mehta.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Javisha, for the warm welcome. On behalf of the panelists and myself, I really appreciate you inviting us on this session. Going directly to the topic of conversation of the negative database. As everybody knows that the world is going digital, and digital is also making it easy for consumers to buy products at the click of a button. This means that it is becoming easy for the fraudulent elements to make use of the technology for their benefit. In the present scenario, it becomes a bit difficult to do so, as any online or digital transaction leaves also a trail, an audit trail, which can be later retrieved and shared with the fellow members to avoid any future frauds. In wake of this problem, the idea of formulation of a negative database has been proposed and industry's best practices also advocates such database. I will now ask my team members or the panelists here to give us some more insights on the composition of a negative database, the challenges that they have come across, what are the advantages of having such a negative database, who should have the ownership, and what would be the typical requirements of having such database. Before going there, I just wanted to let the audience know that there are a lot of statistics available in the public domain. What we see is that the frauds gets reported, but most of these frauds comes with a timeline. The detection timeline is in this cases have been very slow. So which means sometimes it's around 23 months for a fraud to get detected, or even an average time lag goes up to 57, or let's say just short of 5 years. So what is important is to protect frauds, and what is the best way to protect frauds is to make sure that technology can be used optimally. I will now ask Ankit, who is one of our panelists here, based on his views on this industry, on how negative database can be optimally used. What is the need for such a negative database? Ankit, what's your views?
Hey, Kalpesh, hi. Yeah, Kalpesh, negative database is very important in the industry I come from. In the payments industry, where both online and offline payments thrive on trust. Okay. Today, the single most important factor for both merchants and customers to adopt digital payments is trust. So in case there is a single fraud which happens onto the system, both merchants and the customers are hesitant to use the payment systems. We are seeing very interesting times in payments. Recent pandemic has forced a lot of merchants to adopt digital payments, and at the same time, customers also are using various instruments, which has now brought down the size, typical ticket size of transaction onto the digital payments. Earlier, where a typical debit card transaction was a minimum of 3,500, and a credit card ticket size would be 5,000. UPI has brought down those ticket sizes to as low as 300, 350. Even on the card instruments, we are seeing actively that smaller and smaller value of transactions is happening. Now, what this shows is that the adoption of digital payments is increasing. And as it is increasing, more important is to bring those controls and measures which prevents frauds happening onto this platform. I see two critical things happening today. One, as more and more adoption is happening, many offline payments is slowly moving to online, where both payer and pay are not in front of each other. Now, in such a scenario, chances of frauds are very important, increases multifold. And in such a scenario, it becomes responsibility of the participants who are managing this ecosystem, be it networks, be it aggregators, be it banks, to ensure that both the payee and the payer who's participating on this platform is validated, is genuine. And this is where I see that the negative database can play very important role. Second more important factor is that uh, Reserve Bank trying to see that transactions are widely accepted. They're trying to bring the cost of these transactions at par with cash for the merchants. And this means that lower and lower MDR margins for the players who are participating. So a single chargeback which happens onto this platform, which could not be recovered either from the customer or the merchant, then is a loss of revenue, and then may hit heavily onto the players who participate in this ecosystem. So to make this system viable as well, it's utmost important that frauds are controlled. And this is where I see that negative database at the entry point and at the transaction point could be a very important tool to control such frauds.
Great. This is nice to understand that how it protects, the database will protect frauds from future. We have Bhavna, who's again an eminent lawyer from and working at Amazon Pay. Bhavna, what are your thoughts on this? We will be glad to hear your views as well.
Thanks, Kalpesh. In my view, what we are seeing at present in the fintech industry is unprecedented, where the digital payment momentum is more than ever before. The kind of adoption that we are seeing, not only from the customer perspective, but even from the merchant perspective, the push that we are seeing from the government standpoint, and the kind of innovation that we are seeing in terms of the product that is more reachable to every possible corner of the country is something which is unprecedented. So to continue this momentum on one side, what we need is a flexibility. What we need is a framework which is very easy to adopt by every citizen of India. But at the same time, what this leads to is a gap which is normally and very oftenly exploited by a set of people, who come into the system and try to fraud the system, either as a customer or for that matter as a merchant. And what we have seen is that they exploit it from a different angle, and ultimately the entire trust in the digital payment system is something that is eroded. It impacts not only one entity, it impacts the entire country at large in the adoption of the digital payment. To the extent the negative merchant and customer list as a concept is not new. This is a concept that exists, where there is an OFAC list that exists in the US. There are initiatives that is being done by RBI, where a fraud registry is something that they are working on. There is a cybercrime inventory that is being created by the government. But the beauty of this proposal is that the success of this proposal depends how participative the industry is, to what extent are they open to share the details. And I think that's where it is important to come up with a framework which is so viable and open for everyone to contribute and utilize. So to answer it, is it a need of time? Absolutely, yes, because the elements who are coming in the system in various form, they almost remains the same. And what we have seen from the regulatory standpoint is that when these fraud increase, because the same kind of trend happen again and again through the various participants, it leads to a tightening of the regulation. And when the tightening of the regulation happens, it impacts almost every part of the industry. And hence, it is definitely required at this stage. It requires certain enablement, more participation from the industry, would be my initial thought, Kalpesh.
Thank you, Bhavna. This is very impactful as well. Participation, without participation, we do not expect the benefits to be shared with the co-participants. Sunil, what are your thoughts based on your experience and background in this industry for more than a decade? What are your things that you think we should be taking over in the need for a negative database?
Sure. Thanks, Kalpesh. See, based on my experience having dealt with combating merchant fraud, what has been consistently seen, whether it's the online or offline space, is that most of the frauds are actually perpetrated at a merchant location. It's a very, very small percentage, but it is perpetrated at the merchant location, whether it's online or offline. Forget the fact that there could be a hack or anything like, but from a merchant perspective, that's what it is. The other thing is that survey after survey in India shows customers are hesitant to use their cards, whether it's an online or offline space, because, and they specifically say this because of their card numbers getting stolen, etc. I mean, there's a reason why India is pretty much the only place where there's cash on delivery, because a lot of people who have cards refuse to put the cards numbers on the and this could be as reputed a website as Amazon or anything like that. They're just scared to put their card online. So and the other thing is that like I said, it's a very small percentage of thing, but and again, if you see study after study, digital payments, the acceptance of digital payments, especially in the offline space, and as we are going more towards the tier 3, tier 4 with the PIDF and the smaller cities, this is going to be critical because we know that the acceptance of digital payments by merchants increases their sales. And so it would be a shame that because of a minuscule percentage of folks, that the larger percentage of merchants are going to suffer. And so the negative database, and this is something that, since when I got into this, though I no longer am actively involved in merchant fraud and combating merchant fraud, but more from a risk engine perspective. But I think this is really critical because without a negative merchant database, you're going to see, which is accessible by all, and where people put in their the sort of thieving merchants. These guys are just going to go from A to B to C to D. So it's just going to be bunny hopping. So we need to, the need of the hour to grow digital payments is to have a very robust negative merchant database.
Thanks, Sunil. So I think after the first round, we definitely believe that having a negative database is definitely advantageous. The biggest advantage would be helping merchant aggregators to identify the merchant before onboarding them by checking whether they have any fraudulent history and with any other merchant aggregator. It would also save the industry from apprehensive fraud by a merchant who has earlier indulged in such activity. It will also act as a deterrent for the merchant community to restore or to any unhealthy practices, as they would fear loss of integrity as well. So this would hamper their future business. So definitely the need is with respect to having a negative database. Now that leads us to the other round, is that how and what are the challenges that will come across when we create such a negative database? Ankit, what are your prior experiences and challenges when you came across this in your work profile?
See, Kalpesh, as Bhavna was mentioning, that already there are a lot of industry initiatives which had been taken earlier as well. The Reserve Bank negative list for bank account opening exists from a long time. The negative SIF check is a common practice. Even at our organizations, and in fact, all the organizations I worked in my prior work experience, there's always some sort of negative database that we have been maintaining and trying to dedupe before we actually sign up or onboard a merchant. This always keeps evolving basis the type of data that we collect. Right now, it has largely been individual efforts, but yes, even when it is industry efforts, there are 2-3 challenges that I see. One is I see that these fraudsters are very smart. I have seen very interesting frauds wherein your KYC documents are forged so beautifully that it is very hard even to detect basis the AI algorithms that you may put. There are various tools today available basis which you can check these KYCs. But then, today the type of KYC guidelines that exist, and especially, I'm not saying that they have been relaxed much, but yes, there is a continuous effort by Reserve Bank to ease these KYC guidelines, because then we want to bring larger merchants into the fold. And that is where there have been relaxed KYC guidelines, which allows merchants to get onboarded basis minimum documentation. And what happens is that multiple such documents today exist in the country. We don't have a single social security number mandated to get onboarded. Aadhaar is optional. You can provide your PAN number. You can provide your Udyog Aadhaar number. You can provide your passport number, driving license. There's so many KYC documents which can be provided, and the seeding of, say, PAN or one number with all other documents today practically is not very effective, and so it leads opportunities for the fraudster to use multiple documents to participate. So it becomes very difficult to create a negative database, because catching a fraudster basis one document is not possible across. Second is, false positives. There are cases wherein on one address, there may be generic addresses where multiple registrations may happen. And if you take a view of blocking those addresses, there may be genuine merchants or genuine customers who may suffer, who may not be able to use the system, get registered, or have their transactions on hold, which is not desirable. It may then even create a negative trust, wherein a negative view of the system, where the merchants may not be comfortable participating in the ecosystem, thinking that they may lose their money, or the system overall becomes cumbersome for them to participate, and may result into losing customers or business. So it's not easy. There needs to be a industry participation. At the same time, there needs to be effective measures to ensure that these false positives can be curbed. We need to have some mechanism wherein we should be able to identify multiple KYC documents linked to one customer, so that right identity could be captured. At the same time, today, it's a time when there is a very thin line between online and offline payments. Okay, so there are multiple payment instruments where merchants can participate. It can be cards, it can be prepaid, it can be wallets, it can be UPI. And today, if you see, onboarding mechanisms for all these payment instruments is independent and different. So very critical that we bring uniformity across these payment instruments, so that transaction happening on one platform or a fraud happening on one platform can easily be identified across payment instruments and across the ecosystem through means of a central database. Yes, Kalpesh.
Thank you, Ankit. This is very well said. We do come across situations when, as an forensic investigator, we come across situations wherein the data isn't shared for the same merchant, but different PPI instrument, or the instrument, the category that you just mentioned, like the wallets, the cards, the prepaid cards, and that gives a different perspective to the same merchant. Bhavna, considering your company is one of the leaders in this space as well, what do you think, and do you have come across such situations or instances of potential fraudulent cases, and what are your views?
Yes, fraudulent cases happen in every sector, and I'm sure it happens in e-commerce as well as at Amazon. The quantum and the control varies. I firmly believe whatever be the size and motive of any organization, every organization which is dealing in the digital products and digital services will have some control mechanism in order to identify the entry of such fraudster, because there is some repetition behavior which is entailed in most of these transactions. What I believe is that they enter normally in a fintech area, where normally in the payments transaction, because that's where actually the financial transaction happen. But if we see at a larger level, they also can be identified not only by the bank and fintech, but in my opinion, the other industry, for example, the telco, also play a very important role in order to identify. So the first point that I have is that it is about the larger industry to come together to find a solve for this. Because if one person is coming and trying to come into the system through different name and through mobile number, I think that's something that we need a telco as an industry support in order to fix this in relation to their financial transactions. So that is the first point. The second point is that I think the fraud as such is taking very negatively by the industry as well as regulators. So I think there has to be an openness of an acceptance of fraud, because fraud is not negative, and that then it leads the industry and multiple player to downplay that something wrong has happened, because it is always attached to the system of those organizations instead of the innovation that is done by these individuals. So I think over a period of time, there cannot be a fraud-free system ever, because there will be some here and there issues that will happen. But I think as an industry, as a regulator, we should accept the openness in terms of disclosing the fraud. We have to be comfortable to accept it. It should not be taken into negative light. It should not be attacked on those organizations which are coming up openly to disclose that, yes, this is something that wrong has happened. So I think there is a mind shift that is required, which should enable the industries to come together. In fact, the penalty should be other way around. If somebody has not disclosed it, because today also those penalties are there, but more penalties are there in case there are some issues with your system. And beyond penalty, I think it's about the PR risk and the mental model that we have. So it's about acceptance of the fraud, knowing the details, and sharing with the larger industry. The third point, in my opinion, is about sharing the intels. Like, for example, already from a regulatory standpoint, there are so many enablements. Like KYC is one example that Ankit has just given. There are so many banks and financial institutions who actually reject a customer because they have faked their KYC document, as an example. Now, if that information is made available to other financial institutions also, it's as good as a negative list, because this person is attempted with me, but he failed. He can come again in your system and may be successful, which will lead to fraud. So I think those are the point where it's not about those who have done something damaging, but also an attempt to do, which is something which is identified by various controls that every organization implement. I think that's where we should have a guidance, sort of a, I would say, protocol that should be adopted by the industry in order to come up with the solution. And the last one that I have is a sort of a fraud scoring mechanism or a system, and it is a last stage where this scoring should be available for each merchant, like we have CIBIL. I think that's the ultimate point, where for the Indian customer, if you're going for lending, there is a mechanism that exists. In a similar way, the end result is about a fraud score of any merchant. And if you have a very good, healthy score, which means there is no issue with you, in that case, the KYC may be simplified because the risk profile goes down. So there has to be incentive for maintaining a better score, as well as there should be friction point in order to enable it. I think these are the points which the industry needs to come together, because it cannot be forced. It is something which the intent of the industry has to be there, to be open and share these details are a couple of my points.
Very well said, Bhavna. You brought up all the issues: support from telecommunications service providers, fraud scoring mechanism, incentive for maintaining a good, healthy, better score, control guidance. Fraud as such is not, it should not be construed as a negative word. It is one issue versus a system related lapse or an innovation by a fraudster. Very well brought up. Sunil, any specific technology that you think and any challenges that you have come across which can help us maneuver this negative database quickly, fastly, as quickly as possible?
Yeah, so I'm just echoing a lot what Ankit as well as Bhavna said. I think primarily there is a huge need for the larger industry participation in this. And the way we define a negative database should also be a little bit, I mean, there obviously has to be a defined scope to it, but I think it should also extend beyond merchants and the like. But because we need to start somewhere, which is, I'm fairly not, I mean, Bhavna has raised this thing about scoring, something that I don't think there'll be, huge enthusiasm for it, because it also means showing the details of all the good merchants also. And good merchants typically account for 99.9%. So I think we should start with the fraudulent merchants and a listing of the fraudulent merchants. But I think more importantly is that because from experience, I've seen how the reality of the matter is that there is a department called fraud in every company, because fraudsters move at a lightning quick pace. I mean, I no longer do this, but at one point of time, I used to trawl through some of these databases where you could get cards online. So you could buy cards on the basis of how you could buy something for $5. You had a high chance of getting a lot of money in it, or 50 cents, low chance. So it was that. I mean, and this is some 7-8 years ago, and now it's just evolved to a whole different level. And the fact of the matter is that fraudsters are ahead of the curve, and the reality is that fraud combatants are still catching up. So I think a lot of the technology involved in this that should go into this is more accurately when we are searching for someone on the database. And this is the essential problem, and Ankit had brought this up, of false positives. You can't, if you type in a Joe, you can't have 1,000 Joes coming out. I mean, it's a pointless thing. So how do we tackle through, whether it's fuzzy logic or some sort of AI/ML that we put into this, where if we type in someone, we get only some 4 or 5 names with a high probability. That, I think, to a large extent is going to solve this. But again, I mean, and this is Bhavna had said this, that without the industry participation and, to forego that fraud is a bad word, and a lot of folks don't enter, merchants onto fraudulent databases because it's somehow akin to a failure, admitting a failure, but it isn't. I mean, because I think there's no point of a negative database if people, if companies or banks or fintechs are not inputting details and just sort of retrieving details to look at, because you're just going to be looking at the same details over and over again. And these folks will keep changing their names, keep changing details, and we will forever be. So this negative database will, again, unless there's full participation, there's daily participation, it'll be one of those things that, we make, and there'll be a few thousand merchants on there, and then it'll die its own natural death. So we need to build something that's robust. It's usable. It's got a good UI, and the fact that it throws out very little false positives, and no false positives is utopia, but very little false positives. And there is a replenishment of the data that's happening on a constant basis. Only then I think this whole thing will work. And like I said, it should not be just to merchants. I mean, what Bhavna said in terms of, if somebody is rejected for some reason, a lot of these databases, obviously privacy concerns and all come in, but we need to figure out a way where there is more encapsulation. So a triangulation of data, I mean, telcos using a triangulation of data in terms of figuring out who the fraudsters are. Because a lot of times the folks who have, let's say, stolen cards or on them are also the facilitators in terms of as a common purchase point. So a lot of times they're the same folks. So I think technology will go a long way to get this. But yeah, I mean, we need to start small somewhere. We need to start somewhere on this.
Thanks, Sunil. Really appreciate the points related to false positives, the fuzzy logics, the user interface, the UI, and also the access, right? Do you think access to government organizations and even letting them feed in if they come across situations wherein they have identified fraud, would that also work and then
Yeah, I
support
think,
the
see, because everyone who deals with financial transactions should have access to this. Obviously, someone like a impartial I would say arbitrator, but someone impartial organization like IMA would be ideal to kind of host this. Uh, and I mean, because this also requires a whole load of trust again by the financial institution that the data that I input will not be, I don't know how it will be misused, but it won't, that there is a sort of that the data that they input is sort of sacrosanct. So that too is key, and obviously giving access to folks to input that particular data.
Got it, got it. Okay. Uh, before, before we leave for the question and answer session with our audience, I have a couple of points that I would want to bring up with you guys, panelists. Any specific effort that is being built by your organization, anything, any role and any identified person in your system who takes in that role and responsibility of an officer to lead this initiative? Are you creating that space for somebody to make sure that in your organization you contribute towards that extent? Ankit, you want to go first?
Yeah, Kalpesh. So as I said that I said earlier as well that in almost all the organizations that I have worked with, they have their internal mechanisms, similar mechanisms already existing. Even at Mswipe, we have our own database which we use for dedupe before onboarding, and in fact we have a full risk function which does not just look this standalone. This is built into the fraud management system overall. There are velocity controls which are built basis the match that we do when we onboard a merchant, because when we onboard a merchant you don't have 100% match uh, against a database. Then you can always have suspects, and at the same time, in want of business, you would not like to stop this merchant completely. So there are mechanisms with basis score where we link velocity limits, and then basis is transaction history. These velocity limits are then regularly monitored, managed. So we have a risk function internally which manages this with a risk and compliance head who takes the ownership of this function, and this weaves very closely into all the products that we do today. Because as a fintech and full stack, we are not just into payments. We are today into issuance as well, wherein we issue card instruments to the merchants for their spends. So the money that they collect could be used for spends on not just my network but other networks as well. And basis the transactions which are happening, we have a credit function which we use for lending. For we call it cost loans today, wherein it's given for uh, working capital, and we are extending this to revolving credit line. So this has to be built across. It cannot be standalone today, and this has to be looked holistically end to end. And this has created opportunity for a fraudster to enter the system at multiple points, and this can be through one financial instrument leading or impacting other. May not be an impact to payments business, but maybe an impact to credit, or maybe impact to some other in form of issuance. So this is where this is very important within the organization, that it is centrally managed and controlled with appropriate function. And at the same time, then while I'm consuming some products and contributing to certain other, this needs to be at an industry level wherein we all need to collaborate and participate.
Very
So
well taken.
I may gain at for same merchant, he may be profitable customer for me for one product, but may lead to a fraud on the other, right? So this is where it is very critical to have a holistic view and industry participate, because all these financial products are today closely woven.
Got it. Bhavna, your views, and also if you could add more about how you are interacting with NPCI and anything which is developing on that ground, we'll be happy to share those with our audience.
Sure. So I think definitely, like Ankit has mentioned, we also have a department which is taking care of this. There is a constant learning that we are drawing, which is changing on daily basis. What we have realized is that yes, every time the mode of entering into the system is very different, right? While they come up with very innovative ways. Just to give you example, we were, there are some agencies, even to the extent that even in the COD case, the cash on delivery cases also, there are agents, who are actually delivering and collecting the cash, where this negative list plays a very important role, because they onboard by changing the details about them and faking the documents. So yes, there is the mechanism and ongoing learning that is going on. In terms of finding a solve, we continue to work with NPCI as well as RBI. We have a license and we are reporting. We're also closely working with government in terms of reporting the frauds that happen on the payment side. And now we believe that a larger participation is required, because whatever information we get is very limited. By that time, maybe the same thing has happened a couple of times. So I think it's more about having a system which is more real time and collaborated by the industry.
Great. Okay. And Sunil, your thoughts and views?
I fully echo what Ankit and Bhavna have said on this.
Okay.
Like pretty much every organization in the payment space, we have a risk department, FRM department, and there is always a group of people whose job is just to figure out, look at KYC documents, see how it is. We're looking at different technologies to speed that process up, but that's like to look at the documents. But I think when we were discussing this prior, these guys have excellent fraudsters have excellent KYC documents. So most fraudsters can actually pass any KYC checks that you do with them. So again, that comes up to the need for this merchant database. So when we're onboarding, we have what Ankit said in terms of a need group. So we check internally whether they're done. We check against match. But again, the whole point is that the checks are only, they serve a very limited kind of thing. So there's a reason why there's a huge focus on risk engines, because a lot of times this gets there's sometimes no sanctity to the onboarding of merchants. No fault of anybody's. It's just what it is. So when I used to do risk at many moons ago, it was basically, let's focus on the risk engine, because I'm not going to really catch anyone at the onboarding stage. So I think, but that's also a waste of resources, and it does no one any good in the industry to have these fraudsters onboarded onto the system. We need to nip it in the bud well before onboarding, report them, make sure that no one else is able to onboard them.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question from one of our audiences, that how will a customer know that the merchant where the card is being swiped is a blacklisted customer? Is there any thoughts around in this regard?
If the merchant is blacklisted, he will not be allowed to accept the card. That's the whole purpose of this blacklist.
Absolutely.
Makes the case perfectly for a negative merchant database.
Yeah. And the onus of that is sitting with the organization who's offered the card machine, which will accept the card. So the control is sitting at the entity who has enabled the card acceptance, and all of them are regulated. So
correct.
I think that's the control basis which the customer would have answered that I don't accept the digital payments. you can give me maybe cash for that transaction.
Understood. So typically merchants who may have been blacklisted at some point of time are going to be only accepting cash. That would be a red flag sign, I guess. Okay, so with that, I would want to thank all my eminent panelists, specifically the entrepreneurs from the fintech industry here and lawyers and professionals from the legal space. Thank you for joining us, and we should keep in touch. And audiences, feel free to let us know separately. Let host know if you have any other questions. We'll be able to support you as well.
Thank you, dear panelists, for sharing such valuable insights with us. Sincere thanks for joining us today. We would like to thank our session partner, Refinitiv, gold partner, Reactor, bronze partner, Onfido, and knowledge partner, EY. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back in 15 minutes with our next session. Stay tuned.
Thank you.